Wow, I just found something out funny. There's this strange new technology that I've discovered called a microphone, and I just discovered that it helps when it's turned on. Well, that was a big fail. Let's just restart from the beginning. Wow. All right. Hopefully now y'all can hear me. That was that was pretty special. So let's get started here. I'm just going to basically repeat everything I just said, but that's okay because no one bloody well heard me anyway. So I would just like to, before I get started, sorry, that was very special. I would just like to thank the following people for supporting me on Patreon. So that's going to be Seth Keegan, Trevor Halvorsen, Bassam Halal, Tina Fredericks, Running Out of Fingers Rapidly, Nanotech, Mr. Bidwell, Shadow, Graham Hertzeg, Sushil Chanda, and Alat Stabby. So to those people, thank you very much for supporting me on Patreon. It's very much appreciated. And if you like what I do here, or if one of my videos has helped you out, then please consider picking up a copy of my introductory beginner Android ebook. Link in the description box below at wisestblog.com/products. And that is my commercial for the day, except this time with audio. So, all right, let's get started here. Is there still... Oh, I was reading the wrong thing. There we go. Man, what a... See, it's moments like that that just kind of keep my ego in check. So anyways, let's get started here. So as I was saying, I don't have a big lesson planned for today. Really all I'm going to do is just show you really quickly one way to handle, or to get started handling errors with Retrofit. And it's just going to be, I'm just going to walk you through something really quickly. And other than that, I'm just going to try and answer as many questions as possible. Now, as I was saying before, I wanted to just take a moment again to encourage beginners to please start asking more questions, because like I've mentioned this, you know, now and again. Look, I do try and help people with the complicated stuff. Like, I'll try and answer your questions about RxJava, or I'll try and answer your questions about Dagger 2. I'm pretty damn good with software architecture. That's one thing where I will say that I can answer most questions about that. Not most, but a lot of them. But the point I'm trying to get at here is a lot of times I'll just get a whole bunch of questions about like specific API problems that people have. And the thing about that is, like, at the end of the day, the main purpose for this show is for beginners and sort of intermediates. And some of the episodes I find I just end up getting question after question about technical APIs. And unfortunately, I kind of get put in this weird position where, yeah, I don't mind helping people, but if someone asks me a technical question about RxJava and I've got a whole bunch of beginners watching who don't know anything about it, it's kind of hard to sort of backtrack and be like, okay, well, here's RxJava in 5 minutes, and then let me answer your question. So anyways, point of all that rambling being, I'm happy to keep trying to answer your questions, the more technical ones, but I just would like to once again kindly encourage beginners. Please ask general questions. I'm not going to make you feel stupid. I'm not going to make fun of your English. I might make a little joke, but it's all in good spirits. So anyways, let's get started here. I think I've rambled quite a bit. How's everyone doing today? Oh, man. Let's see here. So first things first, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump into a fairly quick sort of demo about Retrofit error handling. Because if you're new to Retrofit, this is definitely something which is something you'll want to know, I would say. And just give me a moment. I accidentally closed the project that I was going to show the code in, so I'm just going to run this and not talk for a minute, because while it's building, my CPU is like churning at 1,000 billion RPM. So just one moment, please. Okay. Here we go. Let's get started. So this basically is one way to handle errors using Retrofit or OKHTTP interceptors. And let's just kind of get into the issue. So one of the main things that you kind of need to think about when you're dealing with something like a REST API is, of course, you're going to be getting specific responses from the server for the most part that you're talking to, but those responses might not be sort of legible or intelligible sort of on the application end of things. So in that particular case, what you want to do is you want to be able to sort of intercept and interpret error messages from something like a database, or it could be a REST service or REST endpoint or whatever, a server. So you want to basically have some way that you can sort of work those errors into sort of, in particular, just to go back to like Java 101, there's kind of two kinds of exceptions. So number one is an unchecked exception, which the way I think of that is like, that's pretty much going to be an exception which breaks the, it's like a normal application flow breaking kind of error. So like I might think like, let's say the URL to your REST endpoint is wrong or something that's so bad that your program can't really recover and sort of go through its normal flow. And then there's, of course, going to be unchecked exceptions. So generally speaking, I think it's safe to say that the unchecked exceptions, those are the kinds of things which you want to actually, you don't really want to treat them as errors so much as expected sort of bumps and things like that that can happen in your application flow, but as much as possible you want to be able to recover from them. Now there's lots of ways to do this, and really all I'm going to show you is just one way to actually get a hold of the error. And so that's pretty much, yeah, let's just kind of jump in. But before we do that, I'm just going to explain to you kind of what's going on here with a fairly low budget visual diagram here. So what we're going to be using is OKHTTP. I'm using Retrofit and OKHTTP, of course, for my REST API. How uncommon is that? And so I just wanted to really quickly show you how this thing's going to kind of work. So, of course, we have our, we can think of this repository / application. Ultimately, the repository is what this stuff's going to talk to, but this is basically just, I want you to think of this as like, this is our application, and then we've kind of got two different kinds of interceptors. I'll talk about what those are more in a minute. And so basically, with these interceptors, OKHTTP basically provides a way that we can kind of intercept the messages or responses or requests or whatever you want to call them that get sent to our GitHub server, and the responses that get sent back down. Now, I just wanted to point out, in this case, we're going to be using an application interceptor, but there's kind of two kinds of interceptors, and there's a much, look at the OKHTTP interceptor documentation. It's quite legible and makes a lot of sense, but basically, when would we want these interceptors, and what can they do? There's different things you can do with them, but what I would say is in this particular case, my goal is, okay, I would like kind of a separate sort of area where I can do some error handling that's kind of global. Because in an application, you're probably going to have multiple different places calling, multiple different methods to one server, generally speaking. And if you can kind of carve out certain sort of parts of your program, pull it into its own class, and kind of deal with it in one area, that's almost always a better choice. So what we're going to look at now is the code, of course. So that's kind of, this is what we'll be setting up here. So what you need to do to get started is, of course, I've set up this class, and bear in mind, this is not necessarily like this is a basics application, so this isn't going to be super complicated stuff we're doing here. But basically what I've done is I've created a class which implements the interceptor interface. So basically what that's going to do is it's going to have this method which intercepts sort of a response object. Now it can also be it can also sort of intercept requests, and there's different things you can do, but in this particular case, what we're going to do is we receive this chain object, and I actually couldn't tell you why it's called chain. I think it has to do with chaining requests and stuff like that. But longer story shorter, this is a bunch of jargon for, okay, before, really what's going on here is, okay, when the request comes in, the response from the GitHub service, so we've made our call to the GitHub service using our REST API, the response comes in to our sort of interceptor, OKHTTP kind of stuff, and then it kind of stops midway between that and our application, and it intercepts it. It's a very well-named class. I have to give, I think Jesse Wilson wrote the library primarily, so I think he's done an amazing job with the OKHTTP. Anyways, basically all that happens here is we intercept the response. And in this particular case, there's different things you can do here, a lot of stuff you can do with interceptors, but in this particular case, all I want to do for now is say, hey, was this response successful? And then if not, throw an error. Now, I haven't actually finished implementing this because this will be sort of an maybe part 3 or 4 of the Retrofit REST tutorial, where there will be some more advanced error handling. But basically all that's going on here is we're just checking to see if the response is successful, which if I'm not mistaken, it's going to sort of check and see like if it's a 400 level error code or something like that. Then we just write the message and the response code to this GitHub error object. Now again, what I normally see people doing, and I would suggest this, is you can create like a class. So you could say like whatever error, I know my friend Durel uses like an error handler class, or I've seen like error util.decode error. And what you would do in a class like that is you could basically give it the you could potentially like send it the response code and the message and sort of decode it from there, and then you pass it into this kind of a class, and you'll probably have different errors set up. Again, when I actually do the tutorial, I'll show you the code, but this is just kind of a quick sort of lesson. But you could pass that into the class, and then based on like, do you get a 404, which means it doesn't exist? Do you get a you know, I'm not especially great with HTTP methods off the top of my head, but 402 or whatever, which I think is permission denied or some shit like that, I don't know. But anyways, longer story shorter, you can pass that info into a class which will decode the error and then return something that you can either display to the user if that's appropriate, or just something you can send to the rest of the application, which doesn't have anything to do with responses and all that, because of course you don't want your sort of retrofit kind of implementation in the front end of the app. So that's kind of how you would go about doing it. And the last thing I'll show you is how do you actually add this interceptor to your OKHTTP implementation. It's pretty simple. In this case, this application uses Dagger 2. So within my, I think it's application module, yes. Within the application module, which is really, if you're not familiar with Dagger 2, essentially this is just the place that I'm building my Retrofit API. All you have to do is, if you want an application interceptor, you just call this add interceptor here. And then I just say, hey, new error interceptor, which is of course the class we were looking at before. And then that's going to be all wired together, and I can handle errors. Now, the cool thing about that is, here's the last thing that's kind of neat. You might be wondering, like, okay, I see that you've got this error handling class, Ryan, but how does the rest of the app kind of know what to do or actually get a hold of this error? Because it doesn't seem immediately evident. And basically, the way that it kind of works is that since I'm using RxJava, and these operations are sort of occurring within sort of the magic of RxJava integration that is Retrofit. Where's the class here? Repository. What's going to happen is, so how this, just really quickly, I'm going to make a call to the adapter. So this is going to sort of we're going to say to our REST adapter, hey, get me these repositories. And then what's going to happen is that response is going to be, of course, returned as an observable, because that's how I have my GitHub configured. If I have it open right here, it returns a flowable of type response in this particular case. And longer story shorter, if this thing throws an error, where is it? If this thing throws an error, if it's a checked exception, it should get propagated to on error. And I also have this thing configured. So like I say, because it's part of the observable stream, when the error gets thrown, it sort of propagates back to the user interface. And the last thing we'll talk about is this is sort of where it ends up. And when it throws an error, because I don't actually want to like break the entire flow of my application just because maybe the user typed in the wrong repository name when they were looking up their repositories, I basically just want to say, hey, on error return, get the error, but let's not actually like just tear down everything. Instead, in this particular case, what I do is I create a version of the view model which displays an error, whereas otherwise when things go successfully, I create a different version of the UI model. But anyways, that's for another time. So yeah, that's basically all I wanted to talk about is basically a quick way to sort of deal with Retrofit and to start actually grabbing the errors and sort of pulling your error handling out to sort of its own separate area so that you can use it in different places. Basically what you need to do is you need to create an error interceptor, add it to your OK HTTP sort of implementation, and there's different ways of handling it, but in this case, since everything's sort of within an observable stream in RxJava, excuse me, basically all I need to do is just throw the error and then it'll get picked up in this on return error method, or on error return. So that is my lesson for today. Very brief, obviously, and I'm just going to take a quick commercial break, drink some coffee, and if you like the show so far, please do me a favor and hit the like button down below. All right, so let's get started here. So what do we got here? So first question, this isn't really a technical question, but why don't I go to live coding instead of YouTube? YouTube is a big part of basically my marketing platform, so it's in my best interest to sort of try and maintain and increase it as a sort of the marketing platform. But the other thing is that if I had the internet connection and a rig powerful enough, I would actually be streaming to YouTube and Twitch and probably live coding. But unfortunately, I just don't really have the resources to do that. But that would be a much better, that would be ideal, because then I was going to tell a local joke that probably wouldn't have been interpreted so well, so never mind. But it has to do, never mind. I'm not advocating anything here, but one of our local sayings might be that by streaming to 3 services at the same time, you're getting 2 birds stoned with 1 joint. Anyways, don't ask me what that means, though, if you don't understand it. Yeah, let's give her here. So that's why I don't do that. So I've got a question about how do you inject when you have an activity with the presenter? Um, let me see what I can do with this question. It's kind of what I talked about earlier, which is, well, I'll try and answer it somewhat here. Ryan, and no, this is not me being funny. I like your name, buddy. So Ryan asks, how do you inject when you have an activity with a presenter that takes a navigator interface, but the activity itself also needs that navigator? Right off the bat, where is my mouse? Holy crap. So right off the bat, the thing about that is I'm kind of wondering why you need that specific setup, because it seems like you might be sort of it kind of seems a little bit like there might be some breakage of the single responsibility principle here going on, but maybe you have a perfectly good reason for both the activity and the presenter to depend on the navigator. So fair enough, I'll shut up about that. But just as a quick note, I'm kind of wondering why you need to do this, but you might have a totally valid reason. So I will try and help you. It's just I'm gonna have to. So for the beginners watching, really quickly, basically what's being asked here is, how do I use, in this case, I'm going to assume you're using Dagger 2. How do I use Dagger 2 to kind of inject a presenter let me just pull up the code, some code. So what could I do here? Android REST tutorial. This is probably the best code for me to look at. So I'm going to open up this Android REST tutorial repository, and we're going to go to list activity. So this is a little bit different, but I think I can maybe help you with this a little bit. So in this particular case, we have an activity that just gets injected with the presenter. Now this is a little bit devious because it looks like I'm using field injection here, but it's actually kind of using, I'm just going to get rid of that error enter. Yeah, let's just remove those changes. But I'm actually, if I hop into my application, you'll see that I'm actually using dispatching Android Injector for my activities. So this stuff is kind of hard to summarize quickly, but what this allows me to do, if I can remember exactly, where's the thing? Builders. It's just difficult for me to teach this kind of thing right off the top of my head and remember where everything is, because I look at a lot of code every day. What I would just kind of say is that it should be possible. Where's application module? Like, provide data source. I'm just going to tell you what I think you should do. I think you should be using Android. Where is it? Holy crap. I think you should be using this Android Injector, because this allows you to sort of, in a way, do... I'm not even sure if it's 100% constructor injection, but this thing allows you to inject into activities before onCreate is called, I believe. So I think it's sort of one step closer to actual constructor injection. But what you should be able to do is, whatever this thing is wired up for, like say it's wired up to your application module, you should be able to have a place which provides your navigator, and also in the same place, or maybe a different place, but wired up using Dagger 2, You should also be able to create your presenter, pass it the navigator as well, and then sort of inject that into your activity. Now I understand you're asking, like, how do I do that more specifically, and I don't have the implementation written out in front of me, so I can't really, and I'm not good enough with Dagger 2 to just explain it. But what I would suggest is I switched to using this Android Injector because it sort of makes, it's convoluted at first, but it helps inject into activities, and yeah. Just trying to think, repository list module. Yeah, that's basically all I think I can reasonably help you with in this particular case. So hopefully that was somewhat useful. I'm not entirely sure if it was, but that's the best I can do with that. This is kind of the thing I was mentioning earlier, is that I will try and help people with stuff like that, but it's things like Dagger 2 and RX Java. I can't, if you're asking about a sort of a semi-complicated thing, it's usually the kind of stuff you need to prepare for to explain in advance. Okay. Okay, so best way to use a repository pattern. Query. Okay, again, let's take a crack at this one. Tina, I see your question. I can get to that next. So this is going to be, let's see here. Okay, so this is by Mike, and that's going to be, so what is the best way to use repository pattern and maybe live data with a list data that comes from server? Which changes real time. So again, I'm not going to be able to give you a super specific answer, but I can hopefully fill in some blanks here. So the question Mike asks, what is the best way to use repository pattern and maybe live data with a list of data that comes from a server which changes real time? So just really quickly for the beginners, repository pattern. So let's just cover what that is. So if you're a beginner and you haven't heard about this, you want to listen to this, because this is like this is just fundamental software architecture you need to know about. So shut up and listen for a second if you're a beginner. So what is the repository pattern? So it has to do with this thing called inversion of control, I believe, but let's try and put this into intelligible terms. So I'm going to open up a graphic, and we're going to kind of see what we're going to look at, what the repository pattern is in the sense of a visual example, and then that'll make things a lot easier, because it's actually really simple. It's not a complicated thing at all, but it's very important. So this is a diagram of software architecture. And so basically this is almost like one way of representing what an application looks like. And if I were to say, like, okay, we've got application, and then which contains an activity, which contains my model view presenter stuff, which talks to my use cases. So you can think, like, anytime my presenter says, I would like some data, it's going to ask this use case. And then there's the data layer. If you're not sure about clean architecture and use cases, you can kind of just pretend this layer doesn't exist, and just a lot of people will just have their presenter talking to a repository. What is a repository? whoops, that was a screw up. So basically what a repository is, I totally keep forgetting to finish this diagram off, but I want you to imagine an arrow coming down and sort of pointing here. Oops. Oh yeah, I just love using this thing. And then two arrows pointing here. So what the hell does this mean? Ryan's like, look at some boxes and the repository pattern is going to make sense to you. So I have an app and it has, let's say I'm building Facebook, and my Facebook app, when it's offline, isn't going to be able to sort of grab data from a server and put it into the app. So how do I deal with that? So how do I solve the problem of the fact that my app is basically useless if I'm not connected to the internet? The way that you solve that is through a repository pattern. This is one way you can solve it. I would argue that this is the proper way to solve it. And how that basically works is you're going to have, so I want you to think of your model view presenter or your app stuff, view and presenter mostly. Your application stuff is talking to an object, a repository, one object. So what we want to do is we want to have a online database or repository or server and a local database or repository or whatever you want to call it. So online database, on the device database. But we don't want our app to be talking to both of those directly, because the thing is, if you're talking to like lots of different things, if you have a presenter, for example, talking to multiple different sort of services, if you change one of the services, that means you have to change your presenter. Whereas if you use the repository pattern, which is like an interface between things, let's go back to the picture. This repository object, what it does is if you think of the presenter just depending on it, my presenter depends on this repository interface thing, but it doesn't actually know what's going on. It doesn't know there's a remote service. It doesn't know there's a local service. It just says, hey, get me the data, Mr. Repository or Mrs. Repository, whatever. And so that's basically how that works sort of in a visual metaphor. I got so busy explaining that I totally forgot what the question is, but I'll get back to it in a moment because I do think this is really important. So when I go to my Android REST tutorial, again, if you open up List Presenter, you're going to notice that it doesn't talk to... let me clear some of these out so that this is legible. Let's get rid of that. Okay, so this is the actual class that the presenter talks to, repository data source implementation. And if you're curious, open up my project. It's in the description box down below. This is the repository pattern. I explain it in the code, but this thing, its job is to abstract this thing, so a REST adapter, and then we could also have like a local database here or something like that. Its job is to abstract this stuff from the presenter, and since the presenter is depending on an interface, I could add like 50 different things in here. If I wanted to have 16 different places where I store the data, because I'm just that concerned about caching data, it's not going to change what happens in the presenter, since the presenter is just talking to an interface. It doesn't know, it doesn't care. All it requires is that whatever is on the other side of this thing, this repository implementation, satisfies the contract. So that's in a nutshell what the repository pattern is. And so let's get back to the actual question, because I know I tangented like hardcore there. But I wanted to explain that because that's a really cool thing. So just really quickly, the repository pattern allows you to abstract out your implementation details from other parts of your app which don't need to, and shouldn't know about. So what I mean, implementation details. So for example, the presenter shouldn't know or care that there's a local and an online data source. All it cares about is saying, hey, data source, here's data, or hey, data source, give me this data. So anyways, that's the repository pattern. So the question was, so what's the best way to use the repository and live data with a list of data that comes from server which changes real time? So really, again, I'm not going to be able to answer. I'm not going to be able to talk too much about the implementation, but you're absolutely right. You'll want to be using live data or RxJava, and you'll want to be representing your application's flow as sort of a stream of data, because of course you're changing it real time. So if I could maybe give you a hint, I don't have a live data implementation I can show you, but I can maybe conceptually walk you through this thing here. Oh, I think I deleted my REST adapter. There we go. See, this is just as a note, I was a couple minutes late this morning because what I'll do is I'll like sort of type out changes and notes for people in my projects, and then I'll forget to change them, and then my projects aren't building when I start them up later. So that's just total incompetence on my part. Totally my fault. So what you need to do, like for example, what I've done here in this Android REST tutorial thing is I've basically represented my entire sort of retrofit calls thing as one single data stream, and that's a little bit involved because what you kind of need to do, what I've done is I have this view model object which is capable of representing all kinds of different states of this particular feature's view. So it could be an error, it could be things are loading, it could be successful data, it could be I didn't get any data. And so all of that is sort of live updated as, like, for example, what I'm trying to get at here is when this observable stream starts, I start it with like a loading view model, and then when this, if I get an error, I use an error view model. If I get data, then I'll use a, it actually gets created in here, I believe. Then I'll use a list view model success. And so the point I'm trying to get at is using live data or RxJava, you absolutely should be able to sort of set up a stream that's just, as the user is typing, you send another, you fire off another request each time the user finishes typing or as they're typing, and it's sort of a live stream that's always updating whenever there's a change. So that would be conceptually how you might go about doing it, but unfortunately I don't have a live data implementation I can show you, so I might have just told you a whole bunch of things you already know, but hopefully that was somewhat useful. All right. That's a good one I can tackle later. I've got two questions. These are good general questions. So I'm going to answer, we're going to do a twofer. So Chase asks, what are essential third-party libraries? Tina is asking, what is Retrofit? Some information on Retrofit. What is it? How does it work? And so I can kind of answer these at once. So this is, of course, this is an excellent question, because here's a person asking me, like, okay, what do I need to know? I would like a list of topics that would be useful to know, and I like that kind of thing because it shows initiative. Like that's the right kind of question to be asking. And I'm not, taking a dig at people asking more specific questions. I'm just saying these are important questions to ask. So, what are essential third-party libraries? So I'm going to give you my off the top of my head sort of rundown of libraries which you should know about. Bearing in mind that with the exception of if you're just trying to learn a new library, I don't think you should ever put in and implement a library unless you have a reason to. So that's just one thing I would like to mention to beginners. That was sort of another question I was curious about, but let's get started here. All right, so for databases. So anytime you're storing data more than just like user preferences or something like that, oh, that was a good voice crack. Anytime you're doing that, you're going to want probably a database. And so your options for a database, you can do a Realm NoSQL database. So what that means is that it's an object. I forget the long technical name, but it stores things as objects instead of in SQL tables. So you can use Realm. Just some. So before I proceed, I do want to mention that if in my ebook I do go over a bunch of different suggested repositories. So just, you know, hint, hint, plug, plug, buy my book. But I'll give you good information anyways. But so Realm is basically, I would say about it, easy to learn. It does have some quirks, but you get used to working with it. Easy to learn. Can have a working DB up in a day if you aren't, you know, a complete beginner. If you're quite new, it might take a little longer. But there's that. There's also Room from Android Architecture Components. And this is going to be SQL based, but basically so this is just kind of a funny aside. I had this comment on my Room tutorial, and like, don't get me wrong, I don't take stock in these kinds of comments, because basically you have to look at why this person would say something like that and draw your opinions as to how valuable their judgment would be. But I had this comment on my Room database tutorial, which basically said, what was it? It was something to the effect of like, wait until you get into real databases. It's impossible to be a good developer without really knowing SQL, like being an expert in SQL. Basically, the person was making absolute statements, and essentially what they were implying is that, like, the most important thing you need to be a good developer is to be really good at writing SQL. And so I thought it was kind of funny, but particularly because when I think of Room, I see an API which is basically designed to get us developers away from having to write a whole bunch of annoying boilerplate SQL. So anyways, just kind of a funny semi-related tangent there. I'm not saying don't learn SQL, but as an Android developer, I actually don't want to spend all my time learning and writing SQL queries. I'm quite happy to have a database that does a lot of that for me, or a tool. Anyways, I totally tangented there, but so you can use Room. I have a tutorial where I build a whole Room database. I have in POS Trainer, I have a Realm implementation. You can check that out. So these are the two libraries for databases I would suggest. You don't, if you're using Room, you can basically just leave. If you use Room with architecture components, you don't have to worry about all the other old things like SQLite Open Helper and content provider and a bunch of crap like that. So that's for databases. For REST. So for RESTful services, so I'm just going to explain really quickly what REST is, which is kind of impossible, but in a nutshell, in a totally non-technical explanation, let's say I have an iOS app and I have an Android app and I have a web service. There's kind of two ways I can talk to that web service. So let's say I want to share the data between the two apps, the two platforms, but one server. What I can do is using REST, which is one way of doing that communication, which is decoupled. So iOS can fire a REST request, whatever. My Android thing can set up a REST API. In a nutshell, REST is a way for services from like different platforms that don't want/need to know about each other to communicate. Now, REST is a big topic. It's a whole sort of architecture that has constraints, but I'm really boiling it down because it's, in a nutshell, REST is one way which we can communicate from, say, a mobile device to a cloud database. So that's basically what REST is. Now let's get into what the options are. So there's three options off the top of my head. There is, let's start with Retrofit. So Tina asks, what is Retrofit? And okay, HTTP. So Retrofit is essentially a tool which us Android developers can use to build a REST API. So we're going to hop into the code for a minute. I will have a tutorial about this up soon. I've been trying to get it done, but it's just been a very busy couple of weeks for me, but for good reasons. Anyways, so I'm going to open up this thing called, I forget, GitHub REST Adapter. So essentially what Retrofit does is I define this, excuse me, my voice is getting all raspy. I define an interface to the GitHub, how can I explain this? Let's hop into where I create it. So here's here's basically Retrofit and OK HTTP in a nutshell. So in my Dagger 2 implementation, I build an OK HTTP client. So REST doesn't need to be HTTP based, but most of the time it is. So I build this OK HTTP client, and this thing will help me basically write my HTTP GET requests and whatnot. And then I build this Retrofit thing. So what does this do? Essentially what Retrofit does is it takes a small little interface, and when I mean interface, when I say interface, I mean, excuse me, a Java interface. It takes that and it sort of builds a, it generates code for me that will turn my sort of simple stuff into things that will get, into requests and URLs and stuff that will get sent to GitHub's server. In this case, it's talking to GitHub. So, and how it does that is I can specify where to send the requests to. So in this case, I'm saying send it to, where is that class? Util? Send it to GitHub's REST API. So this is where it goes to over the network. So I configure that. And then I add my, yeah, longer story shorter, I'm not going to go into too much more detail, but so I configure this stuff, and then we go in here, and what Retrofit is actually going to do is it's going to take this little interface I wrote, and it's going to generate an HTTP GET method. And all of this is a big fancy way of saying Retrofit is basically an interface builder in the broadest sense. It is a convenient tool which allows me to interact with, say, GitHub, which is an HTTP-based server, quickly without having to write a whole bunch of like, it generates URLs and queries and all that kind of stuff in a convenient way, and it looks a lot more like Java code and a lot less like trying to write URLs and crap like that. So that's what Retrofit does in a nutshell. I will have a tutorial out on it. And this is just a very common problem, having to talk to servers. So you can use Retrofit, you can use Volley. I've heard that Volley is maybe faster, but I'm unconfirmed on that. But Retrofit is basically the industry standard. I haven't seen actual data, but through hearsay, Retrofit is the main thing that everyone pretty much uses. It's very common. Volley is Google's solution, so you can use that. And then there's also this thing called Fast Android Network Library. I've heard mixed things on that. It's touted that it handles pagination and a bunch of stuff, but I just haven't heard enough about it, nor have I implemented this thing myself to really pass judgment, but this is another option. Some people have been saying it's great. Some people have said, meh, I like Retrofit, so whatever. So yeah, so that's the main libraries for REST. For image loading, this is a common problem. So if you're dealing with images in your application, you have to really worry about running out of memory. So almost whenever you're dealing with images, you're going to want to use something like Glide, image processing library. And you can do all kinds of stuff, like you can load images in from URLs, you can resize, animate, all kinds of stuff. When you're piddling around with images, you probably want to be using a library. You can also use Picasso, but I think, I'm not sure if it's under quite as much development as Glide, but possibly. What else have we got here? That's image loading. What other? You can use Butterknife, let's say UI management. So there's kind of two things. You can use data, I forget what the actual library is called, but Android data binding. I think it's just called data binding library or something. You can use Butterknife. So Butterknife, so this is an annotation based, what the hell is the word for that? UI binding library. So Butterknife allows you to set up things like, essentially what it does is it allows you to not have to worry about doing all the, where's my fragmentor activity? Butterknife allows you to not have to worry about doing all this find view by ID kind of garbage. You don't need to use it. It's just if you have an app which has a very big view hierarchy, you probably want to use something like data binding or Butterknife. As you can tell, I'm getting a little tired here. That's another, those things are useful. What else have we got here? UI management. I think I'll probably leave it off there. There's like Leak Canary is super useful for memory leaks. That's a big topic for beginners. There's different tools for diagnostics. You can use, like, if you're if you're not the best at writing Java code, which I'm pretty good at it, so I don't actually really use this tool, but you can use Find Bugs. We'll look at your code and look for sort of errors in it, just best practices kind of things. I used it and it didn't actually find a lot of bugs for me, which I was very happy about. But anyways, I think I'm going to leave that question off there, but hopefully these are like the main things. You need a database library, and if you're someone who's like trying to get hired and you want a good idea of like, okay, what should I know how to do? What should my employers expect from me? I would say know how to build a RESTful application, an application which uses Retrofit, know how to do Retrofit, and know how to use either Room or Realm or you could use SQLite Open Helper with Content Provider, or you could use SQLite, which is an RxJava library, but just know how to make a database. All right, I'm going to run a quick commercial break. Probably do one more question, but yeah. 1 Minute bitte. Oh, sorry. Okay. Well, yeah, I'm glad my explanation was useful, Tina. Here's the thing, like, here's just kind of a funny little story. So, for about the first 2 years of my career as an Android developer, and let me remind you that for the first 2 years, I basically only had like 1 or 2 hours a day to learn it, so my learning was pretty slow. I didn't have any mentors. There was no one doing what I do. There wasn't anyone building entire applications in one video. There wasn't anyone answering general questions from noobs like I did, or at least I didn't find them, but which is the big reason why I do this in the first place. But for the first 2 years, I basically knew what REST was, kind of, but no one really explained it in a way that made any sense. Like, I would Google, what is REST? What are RESTful web services? And then I would get an answer like, REST is an architecture or a way to communicate, which may or may not use HTTP. And it has all these different architectural constraints. And the thing about that is those kinds of explanations leave so much out of the picture, especially if you're someone like me who doesn't know, like, off the top of my head what at that point I hadn't run into any use cases where I needed a REST adapter. So I had all these people saying like, learn Retrofit, learn REST, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, well, what is REST? And then the answers I would get would be like vague and full of jargon. And eventually what I figured out is that REST is one way for different sort of platforms and applications, etc., to communicate over a network. That's what it is. Now, yeah, you can get super technical because there's constraints. What makes it RESTful is how you do it, but that kind of information doesn't help people like me who just kind of want to know, okay, what do I use this for? How do I build it? When do I need it? So anyways, that's so I really relate to a lot of people who have issues with REST or Retrofit and REST. This is a good last question. You're totally right. I forgot to mention this, but oh. Okay, so this is a great question to end on because this is, again, it's a more sort of abstract question. It's not implementation based. So the question is Dagger 2 essential? Do I need Dagger 2? Because you'll notice that I would argue that most good developers use Dagger 2. Why is that? What do you actually get out of using Dagger 2 versus not using Dagger 2? Because when you look at Dagger 2 as a beginner, it kind of seems like, okay, cool. I understand that I'm able to like slap this inject annotation on something and then some little elves come out and assemble things for me, but what do I actually get out of doing that? Like, is it significantly faster? Those are the kinds of questions which I wondered about when I first looked at Dagger 2. So the first thing I would say is that your question is Dagger 2 essential? I would say no. Particularly, I would almost say that if you have like a really small application, there's almost a point where even bothering with Dagger 2 is overkill. But how do you make that judgment, and why might you want to use Dagger 2 anyway? And I think, so the most important thing is, in order to answer this question, we need to sort of understand, what does Dagger actually do? And I would summarize Dagger 2 and dependency injection here. Here's the thing. I'm not a big fan of the word dependency injection. If I were to rephrase what that word is, or if I were to explain what is DI, I would say making it so that an object isn't responsible for building its own parts. In a nutshell, we don't need to get super technical. I don't need to tell you what a module, a component, a blah, 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 directed acyclical graph, blah, blah, blah. That stuff's really interesting, but this is what DI is. We're saying for the different parts of my application, which do like functional things, I don't want them to worry about creating their own parts. Instead, let's create objects, or even I think of it like a layer of the application, which is responsible for creating necessary components of an app. So if I just briefly go back to my lovely little diagram, I actually think of my dependency injection framework as its own layer, and the responsibility of that layer is to basically take the burden of building things, constructing objects. Now, here's the thing. You do get benefits out of that. So why is this useful? There's kind of two main things I would say. So number one is that Dagger 2, once you understand how to configure it, it actually does make things easier. So for example, here's a common issue. Let's say I have an application and it has a database. If I were to like not use dependency injection, if I were to like build this database maybe in the presenter or something weird like that, or in the activity, I need to be careful that I'm not dealing with multiple instances of one database, so I need to configure it to be a singleton or something like that. Let's say, so that's the first thing. Dagger 2 can help you manage instances, and what I mean by that quite specifically is if I go into my Dagger 2 implementation and I go into the module, and so in Dagger, when you say this term module, this is a thing that's responsible for building things, essentially. I'm not going to expand on that, but in a nutshell. So this is my layer that builds stuff that my app needs, and I can, for example, annotate it as a singleton. So this is going to kind of inoculate me from having to worry about multiple instances of a database or retrofit service being talked to at the same time, because that's bad. You don't want that. So that's the first thing. It allows you to sort of control building and how you build your instances of the different things your app will need. So that's number one benefit. Number two is by decoupling an object, by making an object not responsible for building its own components and instead passing those components in, this is really key, I can pass in fake components. Why is that important? When I'm writing an application and I'm writing like the presenter and the use cases and the view and all that stuff, I don't want to worry about talking to a real third-party service. because I'm not testing GitHub's server. That doesn't make any sense. Instead, what I can do is I can create like a fake server or a fake database that returns exactly the same kind of data that I would expect from the real one, and I can see how does my application react to that data. And what that looks like in code is, what is the advantage of dependency injection? When I run the application proper, my components, for example, my presenter, gets given the real retrofit implementation, or the real repository. I create a repository object somewhere and pass it in. This thing. So my presenter gets given this thing here, this repository interface, which is basically just where's application? Which is basically just my repository implementation, blah, blah, blah. It gets given stuff when the thing actually runs. I lost my place here. So it gets given actual implementations when the application is executed for real, and then during tests, which is the key here. I believe I have unit tests in this project. Yeah. So if I open up my unit tests, which exist, if you're a beginner and you've been wondering about this, when you create a new Android project, you get main test and Android test. Android test is where you'll put UI tests, whereas this test package here is where you'll put unit tests. And if I open up my list presenter test, what you're going to notice is that I can create a fake version of this data source interface. And I can pass that in, and here's the key. This is the moment you've all been waiting for. Because I'm using dependency injection and my presenter doesn't create the data source, I can give it a fake one. And then I control what that fake one responds with. So in this case, I can say, hey, fake data source, give me a successful view model during this test. So basically what I'm trying to say here is in summary, the two main takeaways of Dagger 2, there's kind of three. You're decoupling the code responsible for building objects from the objects themselves. So the first benefit is that makes the object less complicated. It's not worrying about building its own shit. It's worried about things that it should be concerned about. Like my Retrofit API shouldn't be worried about building itself. It should be worried about being a Retrofit API, essentially. The next thing is that it gives you some control over managing the instances, so it's safer. Like in Android, you have to be careful where you're getting system services from. You have to be careful where you're getting different things. Otherwise, you'll have memory leaks, so it can help with that. And thirdly, when you use dependency injection, which in a nutshell is just like constructor arguments, that's all that dependency injection is. When you give an object its dependencies, you can swap out those dependencies during tests or runtimes, depending on if you want to make your tests easy or something like that. So I'm bloody tired. I'm just going to run one more commercial break, and if you've enjoyed the show so far, or you haven't already, please do me a favor and hit the like button down below. Hopefully that was insightful. Oh yeah. Let's see here. Okay, I'm going to answer this. I've got a lot of questions still, but we're pretty far past where I normally go. I see. I want to answer this really quickly because this is, again, it's important to understand how to do this. So oops. How do you manage the repository pattern? So the thing that so the question is kind of like, okay, as far as I'm aware, Abhishek understands what the repository pattern is. Essentially, the easiest example is when I want a local database and a remote database, or if I have even if I just want a remote server, but I would like to sort of cache data. It doesn't even need to be like a major database or whatever, but I just want to cache some data. How do you actually do that? And essentially what you're going to need to do, I'm just going to give you a hint, is you're going to need to figure out asynchronous programming. And what I would suggest is, how do you actually manage conceptually what you're going to need to do, Abhishek, is you're going to need to use RxJava or Live Data or something like that, which list presenter, where's the thing I'm looking at here? What you can do is, for example, with a tool like RxJava, and I can't show you the implementation right away because I don't have one immediately available, but using RxJava, and I'm quite certain this would be possible with Live Data, although I'm far more familiar with RxJava, you need to basically use it to your advantage. So one of the ways of doing that is to basically, what you want to set up is your presenter, which is talking to the repository pattern. It should basically have one single communication channel. It should, and now that channel could also include like an error. RxJava is perfect for this because I hear the sirens in the distance. I guess my ride's here. Anyways, I live in the hood, but let's, sorry, I totally lost my train of thought. Just longer story shorter, the reason why I'm having trouble explaining this is because I'm trying to think of how to explain this simply, but use a tool like RxJava, and that's going to allow you to kind of handle everything in one single stream, in a sense. And so what you're going to do is basically you're going to use some RxJava magic to wait. There's different operators you can use, so you can like send a request to both your, what it's going to look like is, excuse me, using RxJava, you're going to send like a message to your local repository and your remote repository, and then using RxJava, you basically just wait for both responses to come in, or you configure it so that it'll time out. But in a nutshell, you're going to use something like RxJava, which is an asynchronous sort of library to wait for both responses, and depending on what happens, it's going to ultimately send one single response back to the presenter. So hopefully that conceptually explains what you need to do. Again, I don't have the RxJava code right in front of me, so I can't tell you implementation-wise exactly how to do that, but I would suggest my friend Darrell has an amazing repository, which does include local and remote data sources. And if you want to check out the repository, that's going to be DB shopping on, so that's GitHub, I believe. I think that's his repository, And you guys, you're going to want to check this out because he's got the working implementation and it's in Kotlin. So if you want a really great example, also Android Architecture Blueprints has some examples. So that's going to be it for today. My voice is rapidly going to rags, and I hope that was enjoyable for everyone. And I will see y'all in next week. And watch out for my REST tutorial. It is coming out soon. Hopefully by the middle of the week, but I'm tired of making promises. So thanks a lot, everyone. Hop on the YSS Slack channel in the description box below for an invite link if you want to chat at me or contribute or learn some awesome stuff. That's basically it. Peace out.